Santo Trini. A San Fernando Story. The War of 1812 uncovered. It was never clear why there was no mention of the events described in the War of 1812 in the primary or secondary schools around the world. Although the historical records can be found both in the National Archives in the US and in the National Archives in the UK, the events were not mentioned in all schools. The dispute over territories caused US President James Madison to declare war on Great Britain in 1812. This war occurred years after the U.S. War of Independence in 1776, and it had far-reaching consequences for slaves of African descent. What is most interesting is the fact that during this conflict, which was known as the Forgotten War, the Capitol in Washington, D.C. was attacked and set on fire by the British commander, Major General Robert Ross. He was aided by runaway slaves from plantations in the newly declared independent United States of America. After the war, which of course the British lost, the former slaves who fought under the name of colonial marines were taken to Nova Scotia and to Trinidad, West Indies, to escape the wrath of their former masters. This is the fact which seemed to have been buried in obscurity and purposely omitted from the history books. Even today, few people of African descent know that not all slaves were cowed into accepting their lot, and that escaped slaves were part of the force which stormed the U.S. Capitol building over 200 years ago. It took the recent storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. for officials to publicly declare that not since the War of 1812 has the Capitol building been breached. Finally, one of the most amazing events in the history of slavery and resistance to slavery was acknowledged by current occupants of the Capitol building. Finally, what has been brought out of the shadows of misinformation is the fact that slaves fought against the institution of slavery, and that they took the fight to the very seat of power. They joined the British and rebelled against their situation in the land which enslaved them. It is true that history repeats itself, but the hope now is that slavery would not repeat itself. It was hard to ignore history as we watched in awe as the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. was again attacked and overrun. The Americans, or the Colonial Marines, were the group of former slaves who were relocated from the U.S. to the island of Trinidad, after the war which involved the first major attack on the U.S. Capitol. These former slaves were also involved in the battle which inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem which became the national anthem of the U.S. British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane had some of these runaway slaves under his command when he attacked the U.S. Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. At that battle, ex-slaves again wore British uniforms and fought with the British against their former masters. Those interested in the history can search AmericanBattlefields.org for more information about the War of 1812. Sadly, it took a horrendous event like the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, to shine a light on a part of black history which was swept under the proverbial rug since 1814. A good source of condensed information can be found at AmericanBattlefields.org. The end.